officially, the first underground comic was Robert Crumb in '67, but there was a prelude to that for a long time before that. You had the comic codes and the Dr. Wortham problem in the early '50s. It shut down the really good comic books. And the artists that were later in underground comics were young when they had the subcommittee. So myself and all my contemporaries felt cheated because of the subcommittee that closed down all the really good comics, killed DC except for Mad Magazine. So we had that grudge to bear. And artists by nature are bohemians. That's another factor in here. And the people involved in underground comics were left of center, bohemian, resented bureaucracy and government, and then the Vietnam War came along. And we were all draft age and had to get out of the draft one way or another. And the status with the police was very oppressive, very, very oppressive in the 50s and 60s. So this is another factor here. So you had the psychedelic age that came along with the Vietnam War, the resistance to the Vietnam War. So you had the artists doing the psychedelic posters were all artists at Red EC Comics, all recalcitrant in character. Recalcitrant's a military term that means you can't be controlled or broken. We're all recalcitrants, including myself. So this was brewing over a couple of decades, and then when there were some of the rock and roll posters, the psychedelic posters, that started breaking into panels like Moscoso and Rick Griffin. Gilbert Shelton had already done comics in Texas. So even if Crumb wasn't born, there was going to be underground comics. This thing was no turning this back. So when this came out, it was just like so relieving to see underground comics and just saying, fuck you society. You didn't like the comics code, you ain't seen fucking nothing yet. You think that was a problem? Look at this. And we were in a situation there in the late '60s where the Vietnam War was so touchy, and the country was teetering on right wing, left wing. If we all understood, if the country swung to the right to clean up the dissidents, that our names were on an FBI list to go to detention camps. There was talk about refurbishing the Japanese detention camps. So the underground thing was really a lot heavier than you'd ever imagine, that anyone ever writes about. And we felt this tension, like we stuck our necks out, let's take the son of a bitch all the way, you know. That's when Crumb and S. Clay Wilson, all of them started doing those little, really brutal comic books like Cunt and Jizz and Snatch and Felch. You know, just how far can we take this thing?
Right.
And we were listed with the FBI. So, fortunately, the country swung to the left, and everyone got against the Vietnam War, and we were vindicated, you know. And you know, when I started to become an underground cartoonist in late '68. I was the only one in Los Angeles. Now, there was an underground cartoonist named Ron Cobb, but he did editorial cartoons. But I was the only underground cartoonist, comic book artist in Southern California. Griffin was from Southern California, but he went up north. When I got into it, there was no more than 10 underground cartoonists. By '72, there's almost 2,000 underground cartoonists. It went nuts. It diluted itself out and petered out.
I have a quote from Crumb in my book that I'm writing that says the schlock drove out all the good stuff at that point.
Yeah.
There was like a gold rush that everyone wanted to get into.
That's
and
right.
then also there was the 73 Miller versus California Supreme Court decision on community standards that basically killed your distribution system.
Well, there was another factor that's never mentioned. About 72, the price of silver went through the roof, and all the negatives were made with silver. So, before, anybody could pretty much do an underground comic, but man, when that silver went up, it just really cut it short. So there's a lot of factors, and maybe it's for the best that it died out like it did. You know, the more cartoonists that came in it, the more they diluted it down and it softened it, and it become more concerned with environment, and very sensitive and caring, and it didn't have that fucking bite that it originally had.
Fair to say that you never lost your bite, though.
Well, that's my problem now. But I had trained, and almost everyone was in ZAP had trained at one time to be fine arts artists. They'd all went to art school, you know. And in art school, we all had draftsmanship capabilities, and we had to face abstract expressionism that tried to stop us. Mm-hmm. See? Abstract expressionism is against tight draftsmanship. See? So that we had art educations, but it was in the wrong vein. Mm-hmm. See? So that was another problem there. We couldn't find security in the art world, you know, because we wasn't doing sloppy work. Right?
No, that's the last word I would use for your work.
Yeah. So the representational art to this day is not friendly toward representational art unless it's pop art, and it's it depends on lifting things that already exist. You know, the art world's very unkind to imagination and draftsmanship. You know? But Picasso said, "Sophistication is the enemy of imagination." You know, and that's the story of the art world.
It's a very profound statement.
So here I am, a fine arts artist. It's got a big gallery in New York, and I'm at a fucking comic book convention with my sculpture. See?
And you have an enormous booth. I mean, people are excited by your work.
Yeah,
I mean, it's fascinating because you came out of this whole subculture.
That's right. I was
rebellious
here.
subculture. You've been vindicated.
I was here at the San Diego con for the very first shows they had, the very first cons. You know, it used to be in an all-purpose room in the bottom of a hotel. You know, there were just a few folding tables and about 60 kids with comic books in their hands. You know, it's changed quite a bit now. It's a giant industry. You know, the city of San Diego did everything it could to run this thing out early. Mm-hmm. You know,
and now it takes over the entire city, and they're delighted by it.
It's their biggest event they have. It brings in hundreds of millions of dollars to these knuckleheads.
So when you made the transition to doing comics, doing more art, and then moved into all the other media that you work in, was that an intentional thing, or you just kind of follow your dream?
No, I'd always been a painter.
Okay.
And in fact, I had supported the comics, my time to do the comics, by selling paintings.
Okay.
That's an odd situation.
Yeah.
I got a job in 1965 with Ed Big Daddy Roth, the car customizer, and I was his art director and did his advertising for 5 years. See? And he had a real outlaw world, bikers and hot rodders and all kinds of degenerate situations that was going on. It was a wonderful free world, and I made an enormous amount of money working for Ed Roth, you know. And he had a good understanding of comic books, and the artists that worked there with him all understood comics, you know. And you can look at his material, the T-shirts and stuff he did. It was all wild Basil Wolverton influenced cartoons, you know. So I have not been able to escape this world, you know, part and parcel of it.
Well, an artist follows his kind of vision.
That's right.
Clearly, you've evolved over the years, obviously, as we all do as we get older.
Another important thing is, not only was I not alone, but there was a lot of young artists that was interested in freedom that would not be accepted in the art world for one reason or another. And I was forced to start a magazine called Juxtapose. Mm-hmm. It started in 1994. Me and some friends put it together, and it come out of San Francisco. And the art schools resented it and rejected it, and now it's the largest selling art magazine in the world, and it's in every art school. It's very influential.
It's a great magazine. And it's, again, driven by a specific vision.
Yeah, there was a need. There was a need for it. It just spontaneously had to be.